بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما أما بعد فإن أصدق الحديث كلام الله وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وشر الأمور محدثاتها فإن كل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار وبعد. My dear brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So, Sahih we said, correct or permissible in its foundation and its attributes, right? غير صحيح, deficiency in its foundation or attributes. Simple as that. All right. So I want to try and make things as simple as possible for all of us, inshallah, so that we can remember it. Because all of these things, inshallah, if we can remember them, that will be much better than just having it in our notes, inshallah. So in this way, you can remember that correct in its foundation, attributes, غير صحيح, deficiency in the foundation or attributes. As simple as that. All right? Okay. So in the غير صحيح transactions, now again you have two categories. غير صحيح, unsound transactions, you have two categories. So this is what we're going to be talking about in section 2, inshallah. So the difference between fasid, corrupt, which is one of the categories, and batil, invalid transactions. Fasid, corrupt, or batil, invalid transactions. Now I have tried to do an as accurate translation as possible of fasid and batil, but for such type of terms, at least these primary terms, when we delve deeper, then you can just remember the English terms, inshallah. But for these, primary terms, which are the foundational, which form the foundational concepts, I'd like you to remember the Arabic terms as well. And they're easy to remember, it's not difficult. All right? So sahih, ghair sahih, I think that's easy for everyone to remember. And then under ghair sahih, fasid and batil, these are also easy terms to remember. So although I've translated it there, as you can see in the slides, however, if you can remember the Arabic, that will be preferable, inshallah. So the difference between fasid, corrupt, and batil, invalid or void transactions. Let's check out what the scholars say, inshallah. So the majority view. The majority view. By the way, that red cross is not like a Christian cross or anything like that, all right? So it's just showing invalid or incorrect, all right? So maybe you might get a different interpretation of this, so just clarifying that, inshallah. So the majority of the scholars, they say that fasid and batil are synonyms for one another. You know what's a synonym? Yeah, they have the same meaning but different words. All right, same meaning but different words. So fasid and batil are one and the same thing, according to the majority of the scholars. And again, I've given the references in the slides as well. So there are quite a few references for the majority of them. So I won't mention all of them, but inshallah you can have a look when you get the slides, inshallah. You can have a look through them. All right, so the majority of the scholars say that fasid and batil are one and the same thing. All right, so the Hanafi view. In acts of worship, both are synonyms for each other. So fasid and batil are the same thing when it comes to acts of worship. But when it comes to transactions, all right, there is a difference between the two. There is a difference between the two. And inshallah, we'll talk about what is that difference. All right, so the majority of the scholars say that both are the same. The Hanafis say that, or the Hanafi scholars rather, they say that there is a difference between the two when it comes to transactions. However, when it comes to ibadat or acts of worship, they are one and the same thing. All right. So now let's have a look at how the Hanafi scholars define it. All right. So first we're going to go through batil, and then we're going to go through fasid. All right. So batil is like the opposite end of sahih. So sahih is the other side, which is correct sound, and batil is completely the other side. All right, complete opposite side. So batil is that which has a deficiency in one of the pillars. In one of the pillars. So even transactions have pillars. All right, for a transaction to be complete, it has pillars. Like for example, in marriage, we have pillars, right? So what is one of the pillars? Ijab and the qabul, right? So it's the offer and the acceptance. Similarly, in transactions also, we said there is an offer and an acceptance. There is an ijab and a qabul. All right, so that is one of the foundations of, or the pillars of transactions. All right, so if one of them is not found, for example, then the transaction is batil, invalid, void. All right, so it's invalid. So for example, if I come up to someone and I say, I want to buy that. I want to buy your coat, for example. I want to buy your suit, for example. And the guy says, okay. And so there is an offer, right? So an offer which is, I want to buy your suit. Or the person says, I want to sell you this suit. But if there is no acceptance from the other side, for example, so if the person doesn't say okay or I agree, etc., then that transaction is not complete. So if a person just offers it, it's not a complete transaction. It's a deficient transaction. All right, so this is one example. So in business dealings, batil is that which has a deficiency in one of the pillars, like the trading of an insane person. The trading of an insane person. So for a transaction to be complete, the people who are actually doing the transaction, they have to fulfill a certain requirement. So one of them obviously is that they are aqil. That they are aqil. So aqil meaning that there is sanity. Both are sane. Meaning that both the parties that are doing the transaction, they are both sane. So for example, if an insane person were to sell a car for, say, $1 because they don't understand anything, because they have a deficiency in terms of their mental faculties, they were to sell a car for, say, $1, then that, first of all, the transaction will be batil, it will be invalid. But the reason why these transactions are invalid is, obviously, as we can understand from what we have studied right at the start, that it should not cause harm to anyone. So obviously, allowing insane people, those who are not full in terms of their mental faculties, if they are allowed to do transactions, then they will be harm, number one, for themselves and for whomever they are connected with. So for example, if they were to sell their father's car, so for example, if there's a child who has reached adulthood, however he is not fully sane, all right, and if he were to sell his father's car, for example, for $1, then this is, obviously, you can see what's problematic in it, right? So because there will be harm, therefore, the Sharia has not allowed it. So anyway, coming back to the topic, the trading of an insane person is deemed to be batil. Why? Because one of the pillars or one of the requirements of a transaction is that the trading parties are sane. The trading parties are sane. Another example. Trading of the one who has not reached the stage of understanding. So remember we said before that if someone has not reached the stage of understanding, they are not allowed to trade. All right, the trading is not accepted. All right, so this is what it is talking about. So it's one of the conditions or the pillars that is unacceptable, that has not been fulfilled. Another example, trading in animals that have not been culled with the halal method. Trading in animals which have not been culled with the halal method. Now in Arabic this is called mayta. In Arabic this is called mayta. Now mayta just means dead. Like if you just translate it literally, it means dead. But when we talk about mayta, the word mayta in terms of the Sharia or in terms of transactions, then it has a specific meaning. Now what is this specific meaning? It does not refer to any dead animal. It does not refer to any dead animal. It refers to that dead animal which has not been culled in the halal way. Now, why is this trade considered to be batil or invalid? It is because one of the conditions for trade is that the thing that is traded and the thing that which is traded for, it should be considered as wealth from a Sharia point of view. It should be considered as being wealth. All right? So there are certain things in Islam that are not considered as wealth at all. So if they're not considered as wealth at all, you are not allowed to trade. Khalas, it's from the outset, it is considered to be batil, it is considered to be invalid. One of those examples is the swine pig, right? So pig is not considered wealth in the first place. So you're not allowed to trade in it. All right? So obviously to consume it's haram. To touch, or if it comes on you, it's impure. But other than that, it is not even considered as wealth. All right? So you're not allowed to trade in it in the first place. So similarly, with those animals which have not been culled in the halal way, all right, they are also considered to be non-wealth, or they're not considered to be wealth. It is not considered to be wealth, so you can't trade in it. All right? Does that make sense? Yep. All right, next one. Fasid. Now, fasid is that which is inherently permissible. However, one of the attributes of that transaction is impermissible. All right, and we'll give some examples now, inshallah. So, batil, what did we say? The foundation is, deficiency in the pillar, that's right. So the foundation in and of itself is, the requirements of it have not been fulfilled. All right, so that's batil. Fasid is that where the trade itself, the transaction itself is halal, but one of the attributes of that transaction is haram. All right, so when we say foundation, meaning pillars, so for example, both the buyer and the seller, they fulfill the requirements of being a buyer and a seller. All right, the actual trade goods, the goods which are traded, and the cost or the price which is given for it, both of them are halal as well. However, there is another reason in one of its attributes that actually make it haram. So the foundations are correct. All right, the pillars are fulfilled. However, one of the attributes are that there is a deficiency in them. All right, so examples. A forward sale transaction for which the timeline has not been specified. So forward sale transactions are allowed. So what's a forward sale transaction? Can anyone give me an example? Buy now, pay later. All right, that's a forward sale. All right, buy now, pay later. All right. However, so this is completely fine. All right, and all the other requirements are also fulfilled. All right, and the price also is established. It's stipulated. It's specific. All right, the thing which is bought as well, that is specific. The commodity is also specific. Everything is specific. All the conditions are fulfilled. However, the time has not been specified by which the price needs to be paid, by which date the money needs to be given. That has not been specified. All right, so it still becomes impermissible. However, the trade itself is not impermissible, but because of one of the attributes, it becomes impermissible. So this is a fasid. All right, another example is a sale transaction under duress. A sale transaction under duress. So what is under duress? Meaning someone is forced to trade. Someone is forced to do the transaction. So this also, the foundations are completely fine. However, one of the attributes, and the attribute is that of selling through one's full consent. All right, that has not been fulfilled. That has not been fulfilled. So although in a way the consent is given, because when the person actually goes and fulfills the transaction, outwardly showing that he's happy with it and is given consent. However, there might be someone behind who is actually forcing the person to actually go through with the transaction. All right, so because of this, it becomes haram, it becomes fasid. And we'll talk about what fasid actually does to the transaction. So we'll come to that in a moment, inshallah. The third example is the famous example of a sale with an impermissible element like usury. All right. So batil transactions, invalid transactions. Now this is the outcome of it. All right, so we're going to mention the outcome of these transactions. Does not result in ownership. Does not result in ownership. All right, meaning the transaction itself is not even counted. That's what it means. It's not counted. All right, because if it was counted, then it would result in ownership. The person who has bought it would become the owner of that thing, and the person who has received the price for it would become the owner of that money. All right. However, batil, when the transaction is batil, it is not even considered as a transaction. So it is not even counted in the first place. So it's like as though it never happened. This is what it means. It's as though it's never happened in the first place. Does that make sense? So this is batil transactions. Fasid transactions. All right, so we translated it as a corrupt transaction. All right, so the scholars state that a corrupt transaction does not take effect before possession, and that it is necessary to annul and cancel it. All right, it is necessary to annul and cancel it. Now, there is a typo there, by the way. So it actually is supposed to say, and I'll correct that inshallah, the scholars further agree. All right, the scholars further agree. So there is a unanimous, it's a unanimous agreement amongst the scholars. So all the scholars agree that in this condition, if these conditions are met, then the outcome is that it is necessary to annul or cancel the transaction. But in other scenarios, there is a difference of opinion, which we'll come to now. So there is an agreement. So what is that agreement? So if possession does not take place. So in other words, me and brother Faisal did a transaction, all right? So I sold him the water, all right? And he paid, say, $2 for it, all right? So I sold him this bottle of water, and he gave me $2 for it. Now, there was an element in it which was not halal, for example. Say, for example, he asked, say, for example, he was forced to do this transaction by someone. All right, so say Brother Ridwan, he forced him to do that transaction. He forced him to buy this water bottle and to pay me $2, all right, for that. So obviously this is a fasid transaction, right? It is a fasid transaction. So it is a corrupt transaction. Now, say this transaction took place. Transaction took place, what does this mean? It means that we agreed. So ijab and the qabul took place. However, after the ijab and the qabul, he did not actually gain possession of this. All right, he did not actually gain possession of this. So as long as he did not yet gain possession, so I have not handed this thing over to Brother Faisal. So as long as this is not done, the transaction has to be cancelled. All right, the transaction has to be cancelled. So if we realize that this was a fasid transaction, then it is compulsory to cancel the transaction. So it automatically gets cancelled. All right, but we have to go through with it. We have to cancel the transaction. All right, so if he has given me the money, for example, then I have to give him the money back. Does that make sense so far? Yep. So before possession, the transaction has to be cancelled in a fasid or corrupt transaction. Clear, inshallah, till now? All right, let's go ahead. Now the reason why I'm going a little bit slower with this, because I want you to understand these concepts very clearly, inshallah. As I said, these are important principles, all right? So I'll be doing a lot of revision in between. I'll be going over and over, so please don't get bored. I'm just doing this so that inshallah it can stick in our minds. All right, so this is with regards to that. The next one. The Hanafi scholar Ibn Abidin, he says in his Hashiyat, so in Hashiyat Ibn Abidin, he says that it is necessary on each of the two parties to annul or cancel the transaction without the consent of the other party in a corrupt transaction. The judge will also annul the transaction without the consent of both the parties. All right? So this happens when? When does this happen? Before possession, right? So before possession, according to everyone, the transaction has to be cancelled. And it can be cancelled without the consent of both the parties. So for example, say Brother Faisal did not take possession yet, right? He did not take possession, and now the transaction is cancelled. So we have to annul the transaction, right? But Brother Faisal says, but I did not give consent to annul the transaction. I still want to go ahead with the transaction. I don't want to cancel it. So what Ibn Abidin says is that it does not matter whether he agrees or whether I agree or whether he does not agree or whether I do not agree. That is irrelevant. All right? So if the parties realize before possession takes place, then the transaction automatically gets cancelled without the consent of either party. So parties don't need to give consent for it. It automatically gets cancelled. And the judge can also cancel the transaction. So if it goes in front of the judge, he can cancel the transaction without the consent of any of the parties. All right, so that is not a requirement for the cancellation of a fasid transaction. Make sense so far? Next one. The Maliki scholar Ibn al-Jallab, he says that in his book At-Tafri', that if any person buys something in a corrupt transaction, the transaction is cancelled and the item of sale will be returned to the seller. The item of sale will be returned to the seller. Now, this is in general, corrupt transactions. So these are some general rulings with regards to corrupt transactions. All right? Ibn Rushd, so he's a famous scholar who has compiled the book Bidayatul Mujtahid. He says that the scholars agree that when a corrupt transaction takes place and the item has not been disposed of through a new transaction or has not been altered by adding something or subtracting from it, then the ruling is of return, meaning that the buyer returns the item and the seller returns the price. So this is according to all scholars. This is according to all scholars. Now, when the possession takes place, right, even if the possession takes place, now there are certain things that can take place after that. So for example, if Brother Faisal, he got hold of this bottle of water. Now he got this bottle of water, and obviously it was, he took it, and maybe he drank a little bit of it, and then the rest of the water, he wants to sell it again. All right? He wants to sell it again to someone else who perhaps needs it. All right, so if he sells, or as long as he doesn't sell it, all right, as long as it is still in his possession and he doesn't sell it, all right, that transaction still has to be cancelled. The other case is if it has not been altered. So for example, as long as he doesn't alter that item that has been sold, that item of sale, as long as it is not altered, again, the transaction has to be cancelled. If the item is altered, for example, Brother Faisal takes it and he turns it into, say, some juice or drink. All right, he adds some, lemons to it and some sugar, and he makes lemonade out of it, for example. All right, so now the item has been altered. It's not in its original state in which it was sold or in which it was bought. Right, so the item has been altered. So in that case, the ruling will be different, which we will look ahead, inshallah. But if these things don't take place, meaning the item has not been altered or it has not been disposed of through another transaction, then the item has to be returned. So that transaction is cancelled, the item has to be returned, and the price also has to be returned to the buyer. All right, does that make sense so far? All right. So what have we covered so far? Let's just go over it very quickly, inshallah. So we said that the ghayr sahih or unsound transactions are how many? 2. Which ones are they? Batil and fasid. All right, batil, invalid, fasid, corrupt. All right, so what's the difference between batil and fasid according to the majority of scholars? Sorry? No, but what is the difference between the two? According to the majority of the scholars. They're the same thing, right? So there is no difference. They are synonyms for each other, right? So there is no difference between the two. However, according to the Hanafi school of thought, what is the difference between the two? So what is a batil transaction according to the Hanafi school of thought? It is one which has a deficiency in its foundation, in its pillars, all right? In its pillars or conditions, in its foundations. And what is a fasid transaction according to the Hanafi school of thought? Deficiency in its attributes. Its foundations are sound, all right? Its conditions are sound. However, in its attributes, there is a deficiency, all right? So once that is clear, next one we looked at, if a fasid transaction does take place, all right? If a fasid transaction does take place, then what happens? Then what happens? So according to the scholars, so the general ruling is that it needs to be cancelled. It needs to be annulled. All right? However, according to all of these scholars, if possession does not take place, then it definitely needs to be annulled. It definitely needs to be cancelled. All right? And it will automatically be cancelled. All right? However, if possession does take place, but there has been no alteration, all right? There has been no alteration, and there hasn't been another transaction with that item of sale, then also the transaction needs to be cancelled. All right? All right, so this is what we've done so far. Next one, next point. So does possession result in ownership? Does possession result in ownership? All right, so what does this mean? This means that once there is a fasid transaction taken place, and for example, Brother Faisal, in this example that we've been talking about, if Brother Faisal takes possession of this bottle of water, and I take possession of the money that he has given me, the $2, then does that mean that Brother Faisal is now the owner of it? Because if he is the owner of it, that means he can do further transactions with it. And if he is not the owner of it, then it's not his to dispose of. It's not his to do other transactions with it. Meaning, whatever he does in the future, even if he sells it to someone else, it will come back right to me. So once the parties realize that there was a fasid transaction, if it does not result in ownership, then whatever has been done after that, it will ultimately need to be returned to me somehow. Somehow. All right? And we will look at that, inshallah, how it needs to be returned. But that won't be today. We'll look at that, inshallah, probably in the second class after today, inshallah. So does possession result in ownership? Hanafi view. So the Hanafi school of thought, yeah? So this is what they say. If possession takes place by the buyer with the consent of the original owner of that item, then it will result in ownership. Then it will result in ownership. So meaning the transaction has taken place in full. So obviously, so you have to remember that there's a difference between ownership and there's a difference between permissibility. All right, so although a fasid transaction is not permissible because there's a haram aspect in it, right? So for example, in a ribawi transaction meaning a transaction involving usury, all right? So that is a transaction which is not batil, it is fasid, right? It is fasid. So according to the Hanafi school of thought, even if a transaction of usury takes place, all right? And if the buyer gains possession of the item, he'll be the owner, meaning the transaction will have gone through. All right? It will still be haram. But the transaction will have still gone through. Does that make sense? So we can give another example through the example of salah. All right? So there are certain things which are not permissible in salah. Yeah, certain things which are not permissible in salah. But that does not mean the salah will become invalid. It does not mean that the salah will become invalid. Who can give me one example of that? Something which is not permissible in salah, however, salah will not become invalid because of it. So according to some scholars, it will become invalid, according to some. Huh? Yeah, looking here and there or looking at the sky. So looking at the sky is something which has been specifically prohibited by the Prophet ﷺ. Another example is looking at something haram. So for example, if someone passes in front of you and say, for example, they are not dressed appropriately or something along those lines, and you look at that. So even if you look at that with a wrong intention, all right, the salah will still be complete. It will be deficient, no doubt. So what you have done is haram, no doubt. But the salah will still be valid. All right. So the foundations of the salah are still there. The foundations of the salah are still there. So all the arkan are complete. If the intention is there right at the start, then obviously that is also complete, etc., etc. So all of the foundations, all the arkan are met. However, the person does something haram, which is not a breaker of the salah, then the salah will still be valid. All right. It does not break the salah necessarily. So this is, like an example of in transactions as well, where the transaction itself will be a haram transaction. However, it does not mean that the transaction has not taken place. It will still come into effect. All right? All right, so the Maliki view. So now we're going through the differences of opinion, yeah? The Maliki view. What do the Malikis say? It will result in quasi-ownership. Does anyone know what the word quasi means, by the way? Quasi means like partial ownership. Like ownership, but not exactly full ownership. All right? And we will discuss what quasi-ownership actually means. Next one, the Shafi'i and the Hanbali view. The Shafi'is and the Hanbali scholars, they say that it will never result in ownership under any circumstance. So even if the person that has bought it, has changed it into something, it will still never result in ownership. So the person who has actually taken possession of it, he will still be responsible of returning it in some way. Obviously, he can't return it. So if say, for example, Brother Faisal buys this water through a fasid transaction, he takes it and he uses that water and he makes, say, a cake. All right, he uses it with the flour, and I don't know how to make a cake, but he uses the water for one of the ingredients of cake anyway. All right. And he makes cake out of it. So it's cake and water is something completely different. It's not in its original state anymore. So even though it's changed into a cake, Brother Faisal still has to return the item to me in some way. All right? So we will look at how he needs to return to it, but he will still need to return to it. Obviously, he won't return the cake to me now, although I would love the cake. But, he won't return the cake, but he will return and he will be responsible of giving back that item in some way. How he will be responsible and in what form will he give it back to me, we will discuss that in the future, inshallah. All right, so they say that it will never result in ownership. All right, so transactions, the right of annulment or cancellation. So again, following on from what we have discussed at the start, yeah? All right, so the Hanafi view is that the right of annulment of the transaction is finished once the item has perished in the possession of the buyer, or he consumes it and removes it from his possession through a sound transaction or by giving it as a gift, makes an increase in the item through his own wealth, like a house where he renovates it or expands it, or a land where he plants trees, etc. Or the name of the item changes, like wheat when it is milled and it becomes flour. All right, so this is mentioned in Al-Hidayah, one of the very famous Hanafi books. I'll just quickly go through the explanation. I hope that you have understood the majority of it. All right, so basically the Hanafi view, if you'd like to understand it in simple terms, it is this: that once it becomes difficult or impossible to return it in its original state, all right, to return it in its original state, that is when cancellation is not an option anymore, or the annulment of that transaction is not allowed anymore. So the right of annulment of that transaction is finished once it is difficult or impossible to return it. So impossible to return it, when does it become impossible? Obviously when the item has either perished, meaning it is gone. So for example, if it is water and it's drunk, so it's gone, khalas. All right. Number two, if it has changed into something else, so obviously you can't return that item in the same state anymore. So you can't return that water in the same state anymore. So if you've changed it into a cake, all right. So these are cases where it is impossible to return that item, right? Where is it difficult to return the item? When now you have given it to someone else, sold it to someone else. All right, so made another transaction with it. That is when it is difficult to return. So although it's still possible, you can argue that it's still possible, but it's difficult to return it. All right, so in all of those cases, the right of annulment and the right of cancellation will be finished. This is the Hanafi view. All right, and you know the author of Al-Hidayah, he gives a few other examples, and he says that number one, so the item has perished in the possession of the buyer, so drinks it or consumes it, right? Removes it from his possession through a sound transaction by giving it as a gift, or makes an increase in the item through his own wealth. So for example, if it's a house that is bought through a fasid transaction, and a person makes renovations, all right, builds another story, or adds another room, or something along those lines, or paints the walls, something along those lines. So he makes some change to it, so he makes some addition to it, right? So again, that is also included in this ruling. Or the item changes completely, so water to cake, or flour to bread. All right, or flour or wheat into flour, right? So again, the item is changed. So although you can say it's, you know, the origin of flour is wheat, but it's still changed. It's not in the same condition and state anymore. All right, so even in that case, the right to return it and the right to cancel that transaction has been finished. So this is the Hanafi view. Yeah. All right, so again, as I've mentioned before, I'll just remind again, I'm very sorry to say this, but we'll leave the questions towards the end, inshallah. So any questions which are related to what we're discussing here now, inshallah, we'll leave the questions towards the end. All right, inshallah, but we'll come back to it, inshallah. The next one is the Maliki view. So the Maliki view is that the sale is cancelled as long as the item is in a state of returnability. As long as the item is in a state of returnability. So this was what was meant when, you know, the Maliki view was what in terms of ownership, what was it? Quasi-ownership, right? Quasi-ownership. So like ownership, but not, you know, proper ownership. Right? So quasi-ownership. So if a person gains possession of something, right? If a person gains possession of something, it is still able to be returned. It is still able to be returned as long as it is returnable. As long as it is in a state of returnability. What does this mean? That means it is not changed into something else. It is not consumed. It has not perished. Nothing has been added to it. Nothing has been subtracted from it. It has not gone into another transaction. It has not been sold to someone else through another transaction, etc. All right, so this is what it means by it is in a state of returnability. Make sense so far? The strictest view is that of the Shafi'i scholars and the Hanbali scholars. So what do they say? They say that the sale transaction will always be cancelled. However the transaction occurred, whatever condition the item is currently in, and whether the item is in the same state or an altered state. So under any circumstance, the item has to be returned. How will it be returned? Obviously, there is discussion for that, which we will discuss in the future, inshallah. In the near future, inshallah. But nevertheless, the Shafi'is and the Hanbalis are of the strictest view that it needs to be returned under any circumstance. Alright, so let's go through the opinions again, inshallah. So in terms of ownership, through a fasid transaction, does the buyer become the owner of that item of sale? What is the Hanafi opinion? Yes, when? Sorry? When there is possession, and what else is another condition to it? No. When there's consent and possession. So, first of all, the person who has bought it, the buyer has gained possession of that item. And number two, he has gained possession through the consent of the owner, the original owner, meaning the first owner. Right? What does this mean? This means that, say for example, I bought a car from, say, Brother Ali. All right? And it was a fasid transaction. Now, Brother Ali left the keys somewhere, right? Left the keys somewhere. So he hadn't actually given me the possession yet. So he didn't give me the keys and say, okay, now you can take the car, etc. He hadn't given me that yet. But he left the keys somewhere. For example, he was praying. And while he was praying, you know how everyone normally, not everyone, but some people, I've seen some people do it. You know, when they start praying, they will take their mobile phones out, they will take their wallet out, and they'll put everything in the front there. All right, so in this way, Ali kept everything in the front, and one of it was his keys. So I said, okay, he's praying, let's just take the car out for a spin. You know, I'm excited that I bought the car, new car, mashallah. So let's take it out for a spin. So I took the car. So I gained possession of that item, which is the car. But not through the consent of Brother Ali. Or not through the consent of Brother Ali. So if I gained possession without the consent of Brother Ali, then the transaction can still be cancelled. However, if I did gain possession of it through his consent, through the consent of Brother Ali, then I do become the owner of it. Does that make sense? All right. So the Hanafi view is that once the buyer gains possession through the consent of the owner, he becomes the owner. All right. What's the Maliki point of view? Quasi-ownership. So what do you think that means? What do you think quasi-ownership means? So he becomes the owner if the item is not returnable. Does that make sense? He becomes the owner, he or she becomes the owner of that item of sale if the item is not in a returnable condition anymore. So meaning it has either been altered, or it has been sold to someone else, or it has been given to someone else, or there has been some expansion on top of it, etc., etc., or it has been consumed. So in all of those circumstances, the person who has bought it will become the owner. So if it is not in the state of returnability, the person will become the owner. The Hanafis say that just by mere possession, the person becomes the owner. All right, as long as it is with concession or consent also. But Malikis say that just by mere possession, the person does not become the owner. There is an extra condition that it is not returnable anymore. So if it is returnable, the person does not become the owner. All right, so this is the Maliki school of thought. So what is the Shafi'i and the Hanbali school of thought? Sorry? It will never result in ownership under any circumstance. All right, so everyone clear with that, inshallah? Yep. Okay, so inshallah, mashallah, if the young brother here is clear, I think everyone else should be clear. And even if someone is not clear, then they should be keeping that quiet. All right. Anyway, so the preferred view. So as we said before, our methodology will be that we'll go through so any mas'ala, any issue, we'll go through the differences of opinion, all right? And then after that, we'll give a preferred opinion as well, inshallah. So the preferred view is the middle course, and Allah knows best. So what is the middle course? What do you think is the middle course? The Maliki view. The Maliki view is not as strict as the Hanbali and the Shafi'i school of thought, and neither is it as lenient as the Hanafi school of thought. All right, the Hanafi view. So it is in between. So, Allahu A'lam, this is the preferred view, which is the middle course. So just repeating that, inshallah. The preferred opinion is the middle course, which is the opinion of Imam Malik rahimahullah, who says that a corrupt sale transaction will result in quasi-ownership. If any of the four things are found, then ownership is established for the buyer. Otherwise, the transaction is cancelled. What are the four things? Changing of market price, perishing of the item, diminishing of the item, an increase in the item due to someone else's wealth being added. All right, so changing of the market price, why is that the case? Why do you think changing of the market price means that you can't return the item anymore? Huh? Not really. That's not the. So go back to what are some of the features of Islamic transactions or Islamic finance. Go back to that, and look at one of the main fundamental principles, which probably is the cause of the vast majority of the rulings in transactions and other things as well, other interactions, which is that لا ضرر ولا ضرار. There is no harm and no reciprocating of harm. All right? So how will the changing of the market price cause harm? Sorry?
Suppose if it's a house and it is going up in value, and if he is to return it in that stance, obviously the buyer loses. And if it's lower in value and you return it, then the seller loses value.
So the buyer will not really lose in any of the situations, because the buyer has to return the same amount anyway. The buyer has to return the same, he just has to return the house, that's it. Right? For example, if it's a house that we're talking about, he'll just have to return the house anyway, and he'll just get his money back. All right? But it will be harmful for the seller. How? So say if I'm the seller, say I want to sell my house, right? So today, the market price is, say for example, 500,000 as an example, right? Of the house that I want to sell. Now I sold that house to, say, Brother Widodo. All right? So Brother Widodo bought the house for 500,000 through a fasid transaction. Now, we found out that it's a fasid transaction. Now we have to return it. All right. So, if the market price now has gone to, say, 400,000, so it's dropped dramatically all of a sudden. So there was some incident or something that caused the market to drop completely. All right. So the value of the house to drop completely. So now, I wanted to sell it at that time, but because of certain technical issues, the bay' was considered a fasid bay', and therefore now the house has to be returned to me. All right, but I really need, say, the money for whatever reason, right? So again, for me to sell it again now, if he returns the house to me, then if I were to sell it again, I will only get 400,000 for it, because the market price has reduced dramatically. All right, so it will be like a harm for the seller, right? It will be a harm for the seller. Now in batil transactions, it doesn't matter, so that is not taken into consideration, but in fasid transactions, that is taken into consideration. All right, in fasid transactions, that is taken into consideration. Also, you were actually right that it also is a harm for the buyer sometimes as well, not only for the seller. It is also a harm for the buyer as well. So for example, Brother Widodo wanted to buy my house, all right? So 500,000. I sold it for 500,000. We realized that it's a fasid transaction. He returns it to me. But now by the time he returns it to me, the house prices have gone to 600,000. All right, but he still wants to buy the house because he needs a house for himself. All right, so now for him to buy a house again, straight away, even if he wants to buy exact same house, he will have to buy it for 600,000. So he'll have to fork out an extra 100,000 for exactly the same house. All right, so again, it will be a harm for the buyer as well. So it can be a harm for the seller and it can be a harm for the buyer depending on what the situation is. So because of this, if the market price changes, then that results in ownership for the buyer. If the market price changes through a facet transaction, all right, the right of cancelling that transaction is not applicable anymore. Make sense? Some of you look stunned. No? Is it just me? All right, so that's the preferred view, inshallah. So that's the Maliki view, that if it is in a state of returnability, then it should be returned and it will not result in ownership. But if it is not in a state of returnability, then it will result in ownership and it cannot be returned anymore. And how do we determine whether it is in a state of returnability or not? Well, it will be determined by four things. One of them is the change of market price. The second one is the perishing of the item. The third one is the diminishing and the increase in the item due to someone's wealth being added to it. All right, subhanakallahumma bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka.